Okay, so this session is a little bit different, so I tried to put it in the titles just so that there wouldn't be any horrible shocks, but it is a reading group session, and I was really excited when I saw this on the potential formats for our talk, so I selected it, and I think it's great that BALEAP is doing it, and yeah, this is my first reading group at a conference. Let's see how it goes. Has anyone here been to any other reading group sessions so far? All right, we'll all be in this together. This is
You'll be the best one.
The experiment. Yes, this will be the best one you've been to all conference. Okay, great. So it is a reading group, and this is sort of the topic is using corpus linguistics to understand the academic domain. It's a bit of an excuse. Selfishly, I want to hear everyone's opinion so that we can take that information and help to inform what I work on, which is the Duolingo English test. So we're always trying to better understand the academic domain and the construct and try to use that information to make our test as authentic and comprehensive as possible. And hopefully you get a lot out of this as well. So let's dive in. Oh, do we not have? Oh, there we are. Two pretty faces out there. Yes. So was anyone at Ramsey's talk earlier this morning? Oh, a couple of people. Great. So this is a natural segue on. Ramsey and I are both assessment scientists at DEP, specifically working on validity and research and outreach. All right, so just in case you haven't read the article, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, I thought we'd do a little paper summary, so I'll do a little mini lecture at the beginning just about the paper to give everyone an idea. And that way that should help with some of the questions that are coming up afterwards. Don't worry, the questions, a lot of them can be answered as well, even if you haven't read thoroughly the paper in question. With that said, Ramsey's here to help, so if you don't have the paper but would like the PDF, it is behind a paywall, please email Ramsey and he will respond with the attachment. So his email address is Ramsey, R-A-M-S-E-Y, @duolingo.com. So yeah, if you would like the article, email him. All right, so we'll do a little summary, then we'll look at some questions sort of about the methods, and then spend the majority of the time, hopefully, on implications. So what does this mean for the EAP classroom and EAP tests, and EAP curricula, and all things EAP. We have an hour. This sort of depends, as with any discussion, it is how much we have to say. So take the full 60 minutes, and if it doesn't, that's also fine as well. All right. All right, before I jump into this, any questions about what we're doing here, the format?
I just wanted to ask if it's okay to take photos of the slides.
Sure. You're also welcome to email. Ramsey can send you the entire slide deck as well if that's easier. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so this paper by Kyle et al. So Kyle is a corpus linguist who usually works on lexical sophistication and grammar indices as well, and some of his colleagues. They're really interested in, well, how have things changed in the current university settings compared to in the early 2000s? So we have a lot of corpus data from over 20 years ago at this point, and it's super useful data, but it's a bit out of date at this point. So this is sort of the basis for this investigation. And so Kyle and his colleagues asked, well, how similar or how different are the features of both spoken and written language in university environments within and across different registers, specifically comparing the more traditional non-technologically mediated learning environments, so this is like face-to-face classroom environments, compared to what he calls technology-mediated environments. So this is things like during Zoom lectures or on course management systems, anything that's mediated by some form of technology, both either in speech or in writing. So a pretty sort of broad question. And so he tackles it from a corpus linguistics perspective. And so the way he uses corpora is to identify all these different linguistic features that are specific in a specific domain. So looking at these big bodies of text, well, what does the vocabulary look like? What grammatical patterns are being used in different ways? And this is based on the idea that, well, register affects the distribution of linguistic features. So there's lots of things that make one genre or register different from another, but these are often reflected in sort of concrete linguistic features. So he's not really looking at like the roles of different participants or geographic context, things like that, but specifically language features as they differ across registers. Totally acknowledging that there's lots of other things that make genres different. And so the person he worked with and the university he comes from is Biber, is sort of the big name here, has done lots of corpus linguistics work. And in 2004, Biber came out with a corpus that's been very influential, called, well, TK2 Swal. It's sort of a horrible corpus name. He wasn't very good at naming corpora, but he's good at compiling them. And what they found is that, probably not surprisingly, that university writing has linguistic features that increase informational density. So there's lots of, for example, complex noun phrases and clauses. There's higher degrees of abstract nouns and just lexical words per utterance as well. And in contrast, university speaking has more interactional language features. So different types of discourse markers, more use of second person pronouns, shorter turns. So all the differences that you would expect to see between speech and between writing. What he also found, though, is that some of these features actually can vary across modalities. So sometimes one form of speech and one form of writing is actually pretty similar compared to one form of speech and another form of speech. So for example, syllabi and service encounters actually share a lot of similarities in that both of them have sort of short, not always complete grammatical utterances, whereas like a syllabi in a textbook, even though they're both writing, are actually very different in terms of their linguistic features, like the length of the clauses or the type of lexis being used. So just because something's speech and something is writing doesn't mean that they're always going to be similar linguistically. All right, and so for me and for Ramsey, this sort of matters in terms of assessment, and it can really support the validity of proficiency assessment. So we want to make sure that we are actually assessing the authentic language as it's actually occurring in contexts like university settings. So that's sort of the domain description inference, it's sometimes called. And also, based on that, we want to make sure that what we're testing is actually representative of the skills that learners and test takers are going to be using in academic situations. So that's, can we extrapolate? Can we take these test scores and do they actually mean something in the academic context? All right, so yes, we believe that corpora can provide some of this information, but only if they're representative. So if the corpus is compiled from irrelevant sources, well then the frequencies in that corpus aren't really going to be very helpful. So with that in mind, we're going to look at a couple of these corpora. All right, so this is the abbreviation that comes up 100 times in the paper if you've seen it, which is TMLE, Technology Mediated Learning Environments. So this isn't anything new, but it really accelerated by the pandemic. So the proliferation of online courses, course management systems. And so Kyle here, yes, is trying to identify differences between other more traditional forms of writing and speaking and these TMLEs. And he first did this corpus in 2021, in the original one. And what he found is that in these technology-mediated environments, the spoken input was actually more challenging than in traditional environments. But in contrast, writing is less so. And so what we see is that in traditional contexts, there's a real divide between the features in the speech and the features in the writing. But then in these technology and media environments, sort of those differences become a bit smaller. So the speech is sometimes getting more challenging linguistically, and the writing is getting less, and it's sort of less of such a clear divide between what is speech and what is writing. But with that said, the paper we're looking at now is trying to dig a little deeper and say, okay, well, those are sort of like general trends, but actually, what are the differences between those registers? So what makes one register more complex than the other? All right, so just a quick look at the methods. So he was comparing these two corpora. So TK2 SWAL was the early one, so that's 2.8 million words. Important caveat here that this is all data from the US context, so this raises questions about how generalizable is that. In our survey that we showed a little earlier today, there was actually a lot of consistency between what people were saying were the needs in the US and the UK, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about these results in terms of generalizability, so that's always something important. And then in the new corpus, it's a bit bigger, so that's 4.5 million words. Again, in the same context, US universities, this time between 2018 and 2020, so just pre-pandemic and then stretching into just the early stages of the pandemic as well. Okay, so we collected these big bodies of text, these millions and millions of words, and then we ran what's called MDA, multi-dimensional analysis, to look at all the linguistic features. And Kyle has created a set of tools which are freely accessible and really excellent. This one, TASK, again, not a great acronym, TAASSC, analyzes lexical grammatical features. There's also another tool in that same kit called TAILS, which is for Lexis. There's one for assessing the reading ability level of different texts. So there's a whole suite of NLP tools that basically you input a text and it spits out lots and lots of different metrics. Yeah, and you can download the program, or you can, there's like a Python, you can use the code as well. All right, and having collected all these different linguistic features, lots and lots of different numbers about aspects of lexis and grammar, he then used exploratory factor analysis to try to cluster some of them together, to group them together. So how do these linguistic features cluster in different ways across the different registers? All right, so what did he find? So these dimensions, so these are sort of the clusterings. He actually came up with 6 different dimensions, but only 3 of them were significant. So I'll just look at the significant ones here. So the first one is some of the features, when you sort of, these labels he's named himself, but he found, okay, one of these dimensions, it seemed like, is oral versus literate discourse. So this is more like speech versus writing. So in this dimension, all the speech things tended to cluster together and all the writing registers tended to cluster together. And what you saw is that in the TMLEs, that the speech was more writing-like than previously, and vice versa, that the writing was more speech-like. So this, again, speaking to this aspect that it seems like the very clear distinctions between what is speech and what is writing, linguistically, it seems that there's some sort of merge going on and they're becoming more similar to each other. He also found that out of all the different registers, the different text types, that the syllabi and slides were the least speech-like of the registers, which makes sense. They're not complete utterances, especially on slides. These little bullet points is not very much how people speak. The second dimension, so this was more about linguistic complexity, so both lexical, so the sophistication of vocabulary, both single and multi-words, and also phrasal complexity, is that it really sort of varied across some of the different registers. So instructional videos were the least complex, compared to instructional readings were more complex than all the other written registers. Again, I don't think there's anything particularly surprising about that the readings teachers were giving out contained more sophisticated language. And finally, the last significant one here was dimension 3, which is procedural discourse. So this is things like giving instructions, or service encounters where you have to explain the steps of something. And the way we saw is that there was more of this dimension in speech than in writing. I think that's pretty common. You can have instructions in writing, but it tended to be more in speech. And that announcements and discussions scored the highest on this dimension, whereas presentation slides scored the lowest. And then these other dimensions, if you're very interested, we can talk about them, but I did find other dimensions that didn't vary significantly either across the corpora or across the registers. All right, so that's sort of the whirlwind super fast summary of this long academic paper.